Hollywood has always known how to deceive the world with fairy tale weddings filled with flashing cameras and radiant kisses. But behind that flawless facade, the truth is far more raw. There are marriages that were never born out of love. It is the tragedy of the most iconic symbol of masculinity in America, collapsing in uncontrollable sobs in a hallway on his own wedding night. It is the suffocating anguish of a red carpet queen forced to watch her own daughter marry the very man who once shared a bed with her former husband. And more haunting still are the tear-stained love letters buried in an iron box for half a century, simply because the love between two men was forbidden. Today, we will uncover the darkest files of the so-called Lavender trap, where 11 towering legends such as James Dean, Cary Grant, and Elizabeth Taylor were forced to trade away their true selves, turning their own weddings into contracts, into the most brutal and loneliest performances of their lives. Anthony Perkins, a 20-year marriage to conceal the shadow of Rock Hudson. When people mention Anthony Perkins, they immediately recall the haunting gaze of Norman Bates in the masterpiece Psycho, a symbol of fear etched deeply into cinematic history. Yet behind that chilling role that sent shivers down the spine of audiences worldwide, his real life carried a completely different tone, quiet, restrained, and filled with shadows that could never be named. It was a secret relationship that lasted nearly 2 decades with the king of the box office, Rock Hudson. Everything began on a summer afternoon in 1955 at a private party in Malibu. While Rock Hudson was at the peak of his charm, always appearing alongside a beautiful starlet to satisfy the press, Perkins was just a shy 20-year-old, constantly trying to avoid the camera. And yet, in a dim corner of that party, the two men sat side by side for 2 full hours. They whispered, laughed softly, and it seemed as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. In the years that followed, the press began quietly whispering about the silent couple. They rented a cabin together at Big Bear Lake, left preview screenings in the same car. There were intimate photos of them together at private parties that were immediately destroyed in film labs by studios to protect their assets. By the early 1970s, the rise of gossip magazines pushed both men into dangerous territory. An editor at the time once wrote a loaded line, "If Hudson is exposed, the first one dragged down will be Anthony Perkins." Standing on the brink of career collapse, a perfect marriage script was drafted. Barry Berenson, a talented photographer and granddaughter of legendary designer Elsa Schiaparelli, was chosen. They married in 1973 in a wedding so quiet it felt almost unnatural. After the ceremony, they lived a married life that was deeply puzzling, one in New York, the other in California, rarely appearing together in the same frame. And although Barry knew everything, she chose silence to protect the man she loved. It was not until Rock Hudson passed away from the century's disease in 1985, and 7 years later Anthony himself followed, that the truth slowly surfaced through long-delayed tears. Barry once confided to a close friend, "I was the wife of a man who did not belong to me, but I have never regretted it, because I knew I was the place he could return to when he could not live as his true self." But Anthony Perkins was not the only one forced to live behind a marital facade. And in the next chapter, the story will lead to an even more powerful name, a man who turned his own wedding into the most perfect performance to conceal same-sex relationships throughout his entire life. Marlon Brando, the most meticulously staged wedding in Hollywood history. In June 1960, the American public was stunned by the news that the bad boy Marlon Brando had officially married for the second time to actress Movida Castaneda. Photos of Brando looking sharp in a tuxedo, holding a bouquet, smiling brightly, appeared on every front page like a firm declaration. Brando was a family man. But in reality, that smile was not for love. It was the smile of an actor who had just flawlessly completed the most important role of his life to save a career that was dangerously close to collapse. Before that, Paramount Pictures had received confidential information about an explosive investigation into Brando's relationships with actors such as James Dean and his close friend Wally Cox. The warning was delivered coldly: either get married or lose every contract. And so Movida, a discreet woman who understood the unwritten rules of Hollywood, was placed into the role of legal wife. A studio PR journalist from that time once revealed the blunt truth: there was no love here at all. It was the most carefully directed photo shoot of the year. But Brando's instincts could not be concealed by a marriage. Just weeks after the lavish wedding, he was seen drunk, with his arm draped intimately over Wally Cox, as they left a small hotel in New York. Inside the home he shared with Movida, the atmosphere was chillingly cold. The two rarely shared a bedroom and almost never appeared together in public. Brando could perform flawlessly on screen, but in real life, he could not force himself to become the kind of husband society expected. This loveless marriage quickly came to an end after just 2 years, in complete silence from both sides. Brando then continued his free-spirited, rebellious life, yet he never truly drifted away from Wally Cox, the only man who had ever genuinely touched his heart. Even more striking is a detail the press at the time never mentioned. The Godfather's final wish was to have his ashes scattered alongside those of Wally Cox when they both passed away. Cary Grant, the gentleman icon, and the marriage contract to protect a secret at Bachelor Hall. If there is one name that defines the elegance of American cinema, it is Cary Grant. He was the dream of every woman and the ideal every man aspired to become. But behind the perfectly tailored suits and the smile that captivated the world, Grant was trapped in a silent battle to protect the true love of his life. That person was not any leading lady, but Randolph Scott, his roommate, his confidant, and the co-resident at Bachelor Hall, as insiders subtly called it at the time. Cary and Randolph met on the set of Hot Saturday in 1932. Almost instantly, an unusual bond formed. They moved in together into a beachside mansion in Malibu, a place the press dubbed the House of Bachelors. To ease suspicions about why two of the most handsome men around refused to marry, the studios released a series of everyday life photos of the pair. Cooking together, exercising together, laughing by the pool. The studios wanted to present them as the perfect example of male friendship, but they did not realize that such closeness would backfire. Pressure from powerful producers began to mount as magazines started using words like unusual to describe their relationship. And so, a reputation-saving campaign was launched. Cary Grant, a man who valued freedom above all else, was forced into his first marriage with actress Virginia Cherrill. A friend of Cary once recalled, "That wedding felt more like a press conference than a celebration." Cary followed the script, but his eyes were always looking back toward the house in Malibu. The marriage collapsed after just over a year, and almost immediately, Cary returned to Randolph. This cycle repeated itself over decades, with a total of 5 wives. Whenever rumors about Bachelor Hall resurfaced, a new wedding would follow. People saw Cary marry, divorce, and then secretly meet Randolph again in the shadowy corners of elite clubs. A photographer who once worked for Paramount revealed, "They were in love." That's the truth everyone in Hollywood knew, but no one was allowed to say. The wives were just passing guests in his life, there to fulfill a role for the public. Cary Grant spent his entire life playing the role of the charming gentleman, but in the end, what he protected was a shattered love that could never be acknowledged. The truth about Bachelor Hall remains a quiet, painful note in the history of cinema. But Cary Grant was still fortunate enough to preserve his career until the very end. Behind him lies an even more tragic story, where a staged marriage not only concealed sexual identity, but also opened the door to the forgotten tragedy of the most handsome man of the 1950s. Tab Hunter. Behind the boy-next-door image and a marriage meant to prevent collapse. In the 1950s, Tab Hunter was pure gold for Warner Brothers. With blonde hair, blue eyes, and a strong physique, he was the kind of man every mother wanted for her daughter. But behind the smile on teenage magazine covers was a young man constantly living in fear of being destroyed if the truth about his sexuality were exposed. In 1955, Confidential magazine obtained records of Tab's arrest at a same-sex pajama party years earlier. To prevent a media explosion, the studio launched one of the largest image-cleansing campaigns in history. They not only bribed editors, but also forced Tab into a public relationship with French actress Echica Choureau. The romantic European trips and public declarations of love were, in reality, a survival contract. Echica later admitted in an interview, "I loved Tab, and he cared deeply for me, but there was an invisible wall between us." Tab would often stand silently in front of the mirror for a long time, as if he were trying to find a stranger within his own face. The internal torment became so overwhelming that he began to suffer from depression. He had to date top actresses like Natalie Wood just to put on a show, while his heart belonged to figure skater Anthony Bevilacqua. The broken engagement with Echica and the subsequent cover relationships drained Tab completely. Unlike Brando or Cary Grant, who had the power to negotiate their circumstances, Tab Hunter was merely a pawn in the hands of studio executives. When the truth began to leak, the studio discarded him without hesitation, like an outdated product. Tab once said through tears, "They built me into a god, and then they watched me burn in the fire they themselves lit to hide the truth." His journey from a top idol to a name erased from Hollywood stands as the harshest proof of the cost of living a lie. These marriages were not just facades, they were gilded glass cages without oxygen, where the most sensitive souls had to learn how to hold their breath just to survive. Paul Newman, The Model Marriage and the Secret, inside a green silk-wrapped iron box. In 1958, Hollywood was captivated by the wedding of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. They were the definition of a perfect couple. He, the embodiment of refined masculinity. She, an intelligent Oscar-winning actress. For half a century, they stood as a fortress of happiness without scandal in the heart of an industry filled with gossip. Yet there was a truth that the press of the time never touched. Paul Newman had once been the subject of whispers about a relationship beyond colleagues with screenwriter Stuart Stern. People often saw Newman and Stern together at events or on private trips to the mountains of Vermont, without any sign of family. But just as rumors began to surface, Paul Newman responded with a grand wedding in Las Vegas with Joanne. And yet, the truth has its own way of revealing itself. In 2008, after Newman passed away, a collection of private letters transferred to Yale University stunned researchers. Inside a small iron box wrapped with green silk ribbons, more than 24 handwritten letters were discovered, with no recipient named and never sent. In them, Newman described an intense, suffocating emotion. "There are nights I feel like I'm about to say everything that's inside my head, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid that afterward there will be nothing left, only the judgment in people's eyes. You understand me more than anyone, yet I cannot have you." Though no names were mentioned, the timing of the letters coincided perfectly with the period when Newman was closest to Stuart Stern. A former gardener recalled that he would spend hours alone in a small room behind the library, writing. Newman maintained the image of the perfect husband until the end of his life, yet he never destroyed those letters. Perhaps it was the only way for him to preserve a part of his true self, a part of his life that was only allowed to exist on pages locked away. Paul Newman chose to stay to protect his family. But there was another leading man, more handsome than a sculpted statue, who chose a more extreme path: to disappear just before the final moment, rather than deceive the woman he loved. James Dean, The Final Performance and a Bitter Thank You, inside a wrecked car. In October 1954, all of America watched what was called the Wedding of the Century between James Dean and Pier Angeli. On screen, they were a dream. But behind the lights, it was a choice with no way back. Under pressure from rumors about his sexuality, the studio issued an ultimatum: get married or lose everything before Rebel Without a Cause could even be released. And so a real-life performance began. The wedding was perfectly staged in front of hundreds of guests and media cameras. Yet the people at its center felt lost in their own moment. A cameraman recalled that the bride and groom could not hold eye contact for more than a few seconds. The kiss after the vows had to be reshot multiple times because it lacked emotion. Just before the ceremony began, a backstage staff member saw James Dean standing frozen in the dressing room, crushing the script of a new film in his hands. When asked if he was all right, he replied in a hoarse voice, "I'm preparing for the hardest role of my life. I just hope the audience believes it." After the ceremony, there was no honeymoon, no romantic days together. Just 2 days later, James Dean returned immediately to the set of Giant, throwing himself into work as a way to escape the harsh reality of a cover marriage. The tragedy reached its peak just 6 days after the wedding. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean drove his silver Porsche 550 Spider into the wind and was gone forever at the age of 24 after a horrific crash. The entire nation was shaken. Millions mourned the fall of a legend. But within the wreckage of the car, police discovered a detail the studio had tried to hide for years: a folded wedding photograph in the glove compartment. On the back, written in blue ink, James had scribbled a trembling line: "Thank you for helping me keep this role until the very end." Pier Angeli, too, never found happiness afterward. In a rare moment of confession to a close friend before her death, she sighed softly. "I didn't love James, and he didn't love me either. We were just two drowning people clinging to each other to protect things bigger than ourselves." Cary Grant, a marriage contract at 60 and secret financial support for a male lover. On screen, Cary Grant was the definition of elegance. From North by Northwest to An Affair to Remember, there was not a single role of his that did not make female audiences swoon. Yet behind the doors of his Beverly Hills mansion, Cary Grant lived an entirely different life. For 15 years, he shared everything with actor Randolph Scott. They were not just roommates. They cooked together, vacationed together, and even appeared in magazines under suggestive headlines like Hollywood's Strangest Bachelors. In 1965, when confidential files about their relationship were at risk of being exposed, Universal quickly directed a wedding to preserve Grant's gentlemanly image. The bride was Diane Cannon, an actress 33 years younger than him. The wedding took place in a rush, and people noticed Cary Grant smiling so much that he could barely keep his eyes open in front of the cameras. But Diane soon realized she was merely a pawn. Within the first year of marriage, she discovered that her husband was still regularly sending financial support to Randolph Scott every month. In her personal diary, Diane wrote a bitter line: "I didn't marry a man. I married a shadow, and that shadow belonged to someone else." The marriage ended after just 3 years, leaving Cary Grant in a silence that lasted until the end of his life. In his final interview, when asked whether he had ever been able to truly be himself, Grant simply looked into the camera and said nothing. The pain of living behind a mask was not limited to male actors. Even beloved stars like Judy Garland could not escape the trap known as cover marriage. Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli, 2 generations and the haunting of hidden husbands. Hollywood, in 1945, was not only the capital of lights, red carpets, and dazzling smiles. Beneath that beautiful velvet curtain lay a ruthless machine, ready to crush the emotions and lives of anyone to protect its commercial image. Judy Garland, one of the brightest stars of the time, whose angelic voice touched millions, became one of its most painful victims. Her tragedy began with a cold command from the office of Louis B. Mayer, the powerful head of MGM. Mayer slammed down a brutal ultimatum, forcing Judy Garland and director Vincente Minnelli into an impossible choice. Either get married to erase the records of Vincente's past homosexuality, or both of you disappear from Hollywood forever. There was no room for love, no time for youthful dreams. The wedding of a Hollywood superstar took place hastily, humiliatingly, and coldly in just 9 minutes. Yet the peak of loneliness did not occur at the altar, but on the wedding night. While other brides were immersed in happiness, Judy sat curled up in a luxurious yet cold hotel room. Her groom, Vincente Minnelli, hurriedly put on his coat and left that very night with a blunt excuse: "I have urgent business at the studio." The harsh truth gradually revealed itself when Judy discovered that her husband was involved with a male designer. Her heart shattered. She bitterly called these marriage contracts the Lavender trap. In the depths of her despair, Judy once cried out in tears, "I can't keep living like a mask anymore." But the cruelest tragedy in life is not one's own suffering, but the helplessness of watching your child walk into the same fate. In 1967, her daughter Liza Minnelli married Peter Allen, a promising young singer. Painfully, it was Judy herself who had introduced Peter to Liza. The public and media celebrated them. People magazine filled with radiant images of the newlyweds. But behind those carefully staged smiles was a dark abyss. Peter Allen was not only gay, he carried an even more devastating secret. He had once had a hidden relationship with Mark Herron, who had been Judy Garland's former husband. When the truth was finally exposed, behind the scenes of glamour unfolded a haunting image. Both mother and daughter, two brilliant generations of Hollywood talent, ended up sharing the same tragic fate, becoming tearful shields used by men to conceal their true identities. Women like Judy and Liza buried their pain in silence. But elsewhere, in another corner of Hollywood decades earlier, there was an even more tragic wedding. One where the groom, the most desired man on the planet, collapsed in tears in a hallway on his own wedding night. Rudolph Valentino, a 6-hour wedding night, and the most humiliating contract in Hollywood history. Turning back to the 1920s, the world seemed to hold its breath for a single name: Rudolph Valentino. With eyes so deep they seemed to hold an entire universe of romance, and with fiery, mesmerizing tango moves in the masterpiece The Chic, he was crowned by the press as the lover of a million dreams. Millions of women were willing to give up everything just to receive a glance from Valentino. Yet, ironically, the man who held the hearts of an entire generation never truly experienced a real wedding night. His life was a dazzling performance, but its script was written in tears of humiliation. In 1919, the Hollywood machine needed a public confirmation to solidify Valentino's image as a heartthrob, and so he married actress Jean Acker. Valentino believed he was building a home, but he did not realize he had stepped into a carefully constructed trap. Jean Acker did not love him. In reality, she was a central figure in a secret circle of affection, a group of lesbian artists in Hollywood at the time. The wedding night took place at the luxurious Alexandria Hotel. The moment the door to the room opened, Jean Acker's demeanor changed completely. She coldly pushed Valentino out into the hallway, stepped inside, and locked the door behind her. There was no explanation, no trace of sympathy. The lover of a million dreams, the symbol of masculinity for all of America, stood knocking on the door, calling his wife's name in utter despair for more than 20 minutes. And when he realized all efforts were futile, Valentino collapsed. He sat down on the cold hotel hallway floor and broke into uncontrollable sobs in front of the concerned eyes of staff members. That short-lived marriage ended after exactly 6 hours. Later, Jean Acker would leave behind a razor-sharp remark about that night. "I realized I had married the wrong person, or the right person, but the wrong gender." That deep psychological wound never healed. Valentino threw himself obsessively into work, using the glow of the spotlight to mask his overwhelming humiliation. But fate did not let him go. Not long after, he fell into the arms of Natasha Rambova, a powerful, sharp, and calculating woman. Natasha was not only a talented designer, but also acted as the architect, shaping Valentino's entire career and life. She controlled everything, from which scripts he would take, what he would wear, to who he was allowed to speak with. Valentino became a living puppet in her hands. But the most chilling secret, one that whispered through Hollywood's backstage circles, was this. Natasha was, in fact, the lover of Jean Acker, the very ex-wife who had once locked Valentino out in the hallway. Many Hollywood historians still believe that Valentino's second marriage was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated promotional contract designed to turn him into a money-making machine serving the boundless ambitions of the women behind the curtain. Valentino spent his youth playing the most passionate lover on screen, yet in real life, he remained forever alone. At the age of 31, he died suddenly, leaving behind an immense void and thousands of women crying, fainting in the streets of New York on the day of his funeral. But perhaps in his final moments, only Valentino understood this truth. Sometimes death is the kindest release for a man who spent his entire life pretending to be a lover, yet never once truly lived, breathed, or embraced a love that was genuinely his own. Katharine Hepburn, 26 years as a nameless lover and a funeral she could not attend in Hollywood. There are love stories that require no wedding rings, no vows declared before the press. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were one such painfully beautiful example. For 26 long years, two of the greatest icons of American cinema remained devoted to each other, yet never once signed a marriage certificate, and never publicly admitted they belonged to one another. To understand how it all began, we must return to 1941, on the set of Woman of the Year. At that time, Katharine was a radiant star, while Spencer was an established actor with a family. After just one costume fitting, their eyes met, and from that moment, a quiet journey spanning nearly 3 decades began. Yet what astonishes and confounds people is the extreme restraint they maintained. For 26 years, they never lived under the same roof. Katharine never spent a night at Spencer's mansion, and Spencer maintained his legal marriage with his wife as an untouchable shield. They appeared together at MGM events, but always kept just enough distance to avoid being exposed by paparazzi. Whenever asked about their relationship, Katharine would simply smile gently. "I am a longtime friend. As for love, I prefer to keep that to myself." But the truth was known to everyone. To stay by Spencer's side as he struggled with alcoholism and kidney disease, Katharine turned down dozens of valuable roles. She chose to become his caretaker, sleeping on a narrow folding chair outside his hospital room for the final 5 years of his life, just to hear the sound of the man she loved breathing. The tragedy reached its peak in June 1967, when Spencer took his final breath. On the day of the funeral for the man she had devoted her entire youth to protecting, Katharine Hepburn chose to stay home. She did not appear, did not cry in front of cameras. She simply said a sentence that pierced the hearts of all who heard it. "I don't want to cause any disturbance. His legal wife is the one who should be there. As for me, I have already been with him for 26 years. Katharine accepted becoming a permanent shadow to protect the reputation of the man she loved. A noble sacrifice, yet one filled with bitterness, in an era where truth often had to yield to artificial moral standards. And if Katharine's story resembles a silent, compassionate play, then the next story is a dramatic and almost surreal reality. It is where another Hollywood legend attempted marriage for the 8th time, simply to build a final wall between herself and the relentless scrutiny of the world. Elizabeth Taylor and Larry Fortensky, The Eighth Marriage and the Final Shield. On October 6, 1991, above Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, helicopters roared wildly in pursuit of $1 million photograph. On the ground, Elizabeth Taylor, the Queen of Hollywood, with her legendary violet eyes, walked gracefully in a Valentino wedding gown worth $25,000. She was entering her 8th marriage, yet what shocked the elite was the groom, Larry Fortensky, a construction worker covered in the dust of job sites, 20 years younger than her. Hollywood was stunned and mocking. How could a timeless symbol of luxury bind her life to an unknown man? But Hollywood could not understand the loneliness that erodes the soul of a star. Elizabeth and Larry did not meet at a glittering Oscar party. They found each other within the cold walls of the Betty Ford Rehabilitation Center in 1988. There was no glamour, no diamonds, only a woman in her 50s, worn down and exhausted after 7 failed marriages, struggling with alcohol and painkillers. Across from her was a man carrying the cracks of someone who had fought at the bottom of society. In the rawest depths of vulnerability and pain, they became each other's lifeline. Yet behind that fairy tale wedding was an act of desperate self-defense. Just 3 days before exchanging vows, a cold prenuptial agreement was placed on the table. The terms were crystal clear. Larry would receive $1 million if the marriage lasted 5 years, and as if following a pre-written script, they divorced exactly at the 5-year mark. During his years as her husband, Larry was almost invisible. He did not walk red carpets. He quietly stepped back and dissolved into the massive shadow of his wife, enduring public labels of gold digger or aging toy. But deep within her scarred soul, Elizabeth knew exactly what she was buying. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she said something so heartbreaking that it silenced all her critics. "I didn't marry him for fame. I married him because I needed someone who didn't care who I was. I needed a wall. A wall." Those 3 words captured the despair of a life consumed by media since childhood. Although she later insisted Larry was the kindest and gentlest man she had ever married, everyone understood the bitter truth. Her 8th wedding was nothing more than a final shield. A woman exhausted by men who treated her like an ornament ultimately chose to use $1 million contract to buy herself a wall against the storm, just to breathe through the final years of her life. As we close this list of lavender marriages, we realize that Golden Age Hollywood was not built on glamour alone, but also on silent tears hidden behind velvet curtains. 11 stories, 11 destinies, yet all share the same truth. They could become anyone on screen, but they could never be themselves once the lights went out. Some chose to fight until the end like Elizabeth Taylor. Some became compassionate shadows like Katharine Hepburn. And some secrets were buried forever beneath the grave, like James Dean. These lavender marriages stand as a brutal testament to an era where fame was placed above happiness, where social prejudice suffocated hearts yearning to live authentically. Looking back at those dazzling faces, we do not only admire their talent, we also mourn the longest, most painful role they were forced to play throughout their lives. Thank you for joining us in uncovering these hidden stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe to discover more behind-the-scenes secrets. Goodbye, and see you next time.